Okay, so we are good to go. I'll get started. Welcome, everyone. It's a pleasure to have with us Professor Rajesh Sundarajan from Indian Institute of Sciences. He will be speaking today on a city-scale agent-based epidemic simulator, and it's used in unlocking the lockdown in India. Rajesh has been associated with the ISC for quite some time. He did his PhD from Princeton in 1999, and then he was working at Qualcomm uh, till 2005, and he has been at ISC since then. Uh, so over to you, Rajesh.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jasjeet. Thank you for the invitation to speak here. Are you able to hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So today's talk is going to be on the city scale epidemic simulator. It's actually an agent-based simulator platform for intervention studies that IASC and TAFR have built together. So I'm from the ECE department. I'm also associated with the Robert Bosch Center for Cyber-Physical Systems and the Center for Networked Intelligence. And this activity came largely out of the Center for Networked Intelligence from inside IASC. So I have a huge list of people that have helped us in this particular project. There are some people that are central to the project. That's the IASC team here, the TIFR team here. In the interest of time, I'll not read out all the names. We have also gotten quite a bit of feedback and some contributions as well from the Karnataka State Disaster Management Authority, especially Mr. Manoj Rajan and his team. And SAP has helped us, Rahul Lode and his team, with a web simulator. And many colleagues from IASC, NCBS, TIFR, ISI, St. John's Research Institute, CMC Vellore, Mathematical Sciences Institute in Chennai, Strand Life Sciences, Vadhwani AI, and the Data Science Consortium. They've all helped with this simulator. Finally, I'd like to acknowledge Cisco Corporate Social Responsibility Funding for the Center for Networked Intelligence, which made this simulator possible. So this is how COVID-19 has been going on in India. The infection has spread quite a bit despite the lockdown. This image is from Shiva Atreya and his team at Indian Statistical Institute, Bangalore. So you can see that it's just touching in this figure about 1 lakh. Today it has crossed 1 lakh, and the number of fatalities is about 3,000. The lockdown came about, it has been upon us since the 25th of March, and it was primarily brought in to break the transmission of COVID-19. It's now quite clear that we can't remain in lockdown forever. We must emerge out of this. And for this, we need tools to evaluate various strategies and also adapt to these circumstances. So we have built two tools, and I'm going to speak about one of them in detail, and if time permits, about the other one as well. So the first tool is the agent-based simulator. It's a city scale simulator. We have made it open source. And you can go to this particular website, cni.iac.ac.in/simulator to see this. And then I will speak about the workplace readiness if I have time. For whom have we built these tools? From the get-go, we were very clear that we were going to build tools to help city and state administrators with their decision making. So it's largely for them. So we've worked with the KSDMA, that's the Karnataka State Disaster Management Authority, and our TIFR Mumbai colleagues are in touch with similar authorities in Mumbai. We hope that our tool will be useful in other cities, so we welcome collaboration. So if somebody wants to build a similar city scale simulator for other cities, do contact us. We also want to help organizations come out of the lockdown, for which we built this workplace readiness indicator. Of course, I'm going to get to it only if I have time. So the tool that we have, the city scale simulator, has been used for various studies, and I'm going to highlight all of them, various phased emergences from the lockdown. So we put out a report, and you can search for unlocking the lockdown in India, IACTIFR, and you should have access to this report. We have used it for another study, which is to highlight the importance of compliance. We have used it for a third study, which is the impact of opening up train services in Mumbai. And then what type of containment zones should one use, which is more effective. ward-wise or 100-meter radius zone-wise containment. I will highlight all of these things. And then workplace readiness if there is time. So first, what is a city scale agent-based model? Here are two cities, Bangalore and Mumbai. Both of them have large populations, 1.23 crore agents in Bangalore, individuals in Bangalore, and about 1.24 crore individuals in the area called BMC. This doesn't include a much larger Mumbai that includes Navi Mumbai and other such areas. It's called the Brihan Mumbai Metropolitan Corporation. This has 1.24 crore agents. In Bangalore, the population is divided into 198 wards. So we have relatively smaller wards. In Mumbai, it's only about 24 wards. That means roughly on the average, there are about 5 lakh per ward, whereas in Bangalore, it's a lot smaller. Okay, so an agent-based simulator is something where we have a synthetic version of these cities, and it's based on the population data that we get from, let's say, census. It's also based on geographical information that we can get. Smart Cities mission actually makes this data available for the public to use. So one could gather all these data, curate it in an appropriate way, and then create a synthetic city. Now, what does the synthetic city have? For the 1.23 crore agents in Bangalore, we have one digital version of, for each of the 1.23 crores, we have one digital version. So once you instantiate these individuals, we then instantiate various houses, those are the houses, community places, schools, and so on. And then we allocate these individuals to each of these entities. So a person has a home, a person has an office that he might go to, a person may also have a school that he or she might go to. There is a marketplace that this individual may go to. Maybe there is use of transport space as well. So once you create all these entities and bring in these associations, that's basically the large network that are created to generate the city. So for example, let's say that this is the city. So in the city, there are shops located at various places, factories maybe, hospitals, schools, homes, community areas, workplaces, and so on. Once you do this, then typically what would happen in an activity model setup is you would have these individuals perform activities at various times of the day. We don't go to that level of detail, but we do take into account the interactions that happen in each of these particular entities. And these entities are like local social networks. So to be a little more
Rajesh, can
yes,
you keep the mic a little bit closer to you?
Okay, is it better now?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Okay, so I'll speak into the microphone. Okay, so to be a little more abstract, so one can build a graph with individuals. So these black dots are the individuals. And then there are various kinds of networks involving, or various kinds of graphs involving these nodes, which are the individuals. So for example, you might have a household network. So that would be these 4 individuals corresponding to one home. These 4 are in a household, so they would form another network. These 3 are in another home, they would form another network. So that's one kind of a network. So usually these household networks are cliques, and therefore one can abstract these cliques in the form of this graph with cliques in the form of a bipartite graph, and that would be individuals and these homes. For every home, you basically bring out an abstract entity, and then you connect up all those individuals that belong to home to this particular abstract household node, and so on. So from the original graph, which is made of only individuals and cliques, which are households, you bring out this graph. Similarly, there is now interaction across homes, because individuals from maybe this home may go to this particular school, and they perhaps are in the same class. So you then build another clique for the same node, and this for the same set of nodes. And this clique is now a clique of schools. So once again, you abstract that out. And for each school, you create a particular node and associate every individual who goes to that school via an edge that connects up the individuals to this particular school. As many schools as you have in the city, you will have that many such nodes on this side. And that would be another bipartite graph. Similarly, there are market areas that people go to. In our case, we have essentially taken wards to be the markets, or sub wards in the case of Mumbai to be markets, to be the places where people interact as a market space type interaction. And we also have public transport spaces where people might interact. All of those are also bipartite graphs, and you will see one bipartite graph for every such interaction space. So market would be a node here, and then public transport would be another node here, and so on. Then in this, there are also workplace interactions that happen, and that's also abstracted in the form of another bipartite graph here. And so really what's happening is that we have various social networks that individuals are involved in, and interactions happen across these social networks. In particular, in our COVID-19 context, an individual that goes to a school may contract the infection there. He might bring it home. And so that means that he's spreading it in this particular home. Somebody else in that home may get infected, but that person is associated with the workplace, may go to the workplace and spread it there, or to the marketplace and spread it there, and so on. So it's really a bunch of various networks, and these networks are interacting with each other, and the interactions are through these individuals. So individuals are central to it. So that's why there's an okay, so how real is our synthetic Bangalore compared to the real Bangalore? So in here you will see something in blue. That's the data that we get, which basically gives the age profile in this particular city. And the red one is how faithful our instantiation of the city is to the data that we get. So in case of Bangalore, we have actually been quite faithful to it. Similarly, from the census data, we also get household sizes. And so you have this information in blue, which is the data from census. And what we have here, the reds are essentially the outcomes of our instantiated city. So there's a good match here as well. This one is workplace size. So when we instantiate workplaces, we also associate individuals to these workplaces. So how faithful are we to the true workplace distribution, workplace size distributions? So you can see that we are quite good here, but when it comes to these places, these large workplaces, there is quite a bit of variation. And this is actually quite natural because we are actually generating a synthetic city in a random way. And this is the mean that you are likely to see. And any particular instantiation in these large sized work environments is likely to be random because there are fewer of these. And so you see that there is a little bit of variation here. This is actually the commute distances. So when we create this city, we map agents to households, but we also map people that go to offices to workplaces. And when we do this, we try to take into account the commute distances into account. And for Bangalore, we happen to have this data based on surveys that were conducted. And then we fit a model to this. And then we pass this model to our city generator. And our city generator tried to come up with a fit for this. So when it created, of course, we struggled to fit to this. So there are some things which are off. For example, there is somewhat larger density of single person shops, but we have a somewhat smaller number of them. On the other hand, we have, sorry, this is workplace distance. So there are a large fraction of people that actually travel very little, but somehow that is reduced. But we have pushed a little bit of mass to this particular place. So as one goes further and refines these models, we anticipate that we'll actually get closer and closer to what has been input. This one here is school sizes. So this is the input data, and this is the synthetic city that has been created. So in some sense, but for this, and the deviations here, which we anticipate will happen, we are reasonably close to what Bangalore actually has. One needs one more entity, one more piece of information to be able to build an agent-based epidemic simulator. So with the information here, we can actually create a synthetic city, but we are using it for some purpose to study infection spread in the city. So for this, we need to know how the infection spreads. We need to know the biology for the disease. So here is something that we have been able to take from various papers. So COVID-19 spreads like this. So this is summarizing the best, summarizing the information that we have gathered from various papers. So once a person is exposed to it, we believe that we don't have immunity to this particular disease. So we will be exposed, and the virus does spread does grow in our body. There is a certain amount of incubation period. We have modeled this as a random quantity with a mean of about 4.58 days. After that, perhaps you have been able to fight off the infection, but there is a brief period when you could potentially be infectious. This is called asymptomatic transmission. It's not clear whether this particular, whether there is asymptomatic transmission or not, but it is somewhat cautious and prudent to assume that there might be asymptomatic transmission. So in our model, we basically treated both asymptomatic transmission and presymptomatic transmission similarly. So an individual perhaps is infectious for a brief period, and then his body wins and he's able to fight the virus, and he recovers and moves to this recovered state. It is also possible that the individual succumbs to this infection and starts showing symptoms. And when that happens, there is a brief period, there is a period of about maybe 5 days. That's what studies indicate, for which the symptoms last. This is a random quantity. Some individuals recover faster, some individuals recover slower, but on the average, it's believed to be about 5 days. And once you're able to fight the infection, the symptoms become, you're relieved of the symptoms, and then you recover. But some individuals may need hospital care, and then they move to the hospital. Once you move to the hospital, we assume in our model that you're removed, you're no longer going to infect. So we assume that there is no what is called nosocomial transmission. That's something that could be modeled, but we are not modeling it in our current simulator. And so from this point on, there is a progression that we largely use to estimate how many hospital beds one might need and how many critical care units one might need, and so on. And there is branching here, which is age dependent, which is all based on data that people have published as far as this particular disease is concerned. Now, there is quite a bit of uncertainty as to what is the number of asymptomatics, etc. So, for example, there is a study of the Diamond Princess cruise ship passengers, which says that there roughly about 60% were asymptomatic. They tested positive for COVID, but they did not show, or at least didn't recollect having any symptoms. On the other hand, there are some other studies which indicate that the asymptomatic fraction may be as low as 0.2, that is 20%. So there's quite a bit of debate about what the right number is. And so one must deal with this uncertainty when one is coming up with the simulator. So so once you have this, you can essentially build an agent-based simulator. So we created a synthetic city. We know how the infection progresses, at least in this model. So you seed the city with infection, and then you let people interact and see how the infection spreads. So that's all there is to the agent-based model. Of course, there are some other features that you need to bring in to study interventions, but if you just want to count how the infection will spread, this suffices. Now, what have we used this agent-based model for? How is it different from the other models, particularly the SCIR models? So here we explicitly bring in home networks, school network, office network, community space network, and transport spaces. So if the local authorities want to control each one of these in a somewhat different way, we can see what that control would result, what kind of infection spread would it result in. So for example, you can do home quarantine. How does that affect the infection spread? You can open up only a certain number of offices, maybe at 33% attendance. How does the infection spread in that case? So we can study all of these things if one has an agent-based model. Also, you can bring in individual-centric controls. For example, an individual who's tested, let's say an individual has been hospitalized, then you know that, hello, are you able to hear me?
Yes, Rajesh, we can hear you clearly.
Yeah. So then you know that that particular household is affected, and you can put a perimeter around that household, that specific household, and cordon off the neighborhood alone. So that sort of specific interventions could be studied using this particular model. In addition, it takes into account the specific demographics and specific transportation related aspects of the city. For example, in Mumbai, we have been able to bring the effect of trains into our model. It requires further study, but all the hooks are in place, and we have some preliminary reports, and I'll share one of them with you. And it, as I already mentioned, enables study of targeted interventions. Okay, so before I get to the studies themselves, I'll now show a toy simulator that we have built as an education tool. This is something that you can play with. You can go to this cni.iac.ac.in simulator, and then you can choose either Bangalore or Mumbai. Currently, the population is 1/100th the actual size, so it's about 1 lakh, whereas the actual size of Bangalore and Mumbai is roughly 1.25 crores. Then you can choose the simulation duration, and you can set, for example, your own disease progression parameters. So if you feel that the asymptomatic transmission is as in the Diamond Princess, you can change this to a different value than the 33% that we have. This is the symptomatic fraction. We have chosen to be 67%. You can choose it to be something else if new studies indicate that it's something else. Also, these are mean parameters that you can choose, and you can also identify, if you have a different protocol for hospital stay, you can choose different parameters here. And then there are contact parameters that you can tune, contacts at households, contact at workplaces, schools, community, public transport, and so on. And you can seed the infection with a certain fraction of individuals infected at time 0. In this case, it's March 1st. And then you can let the simulator run. Now, before you do this, you can choose various interventions as well. Usually the default simulation is for the no intervention case, but I'm going to show you about 3. One is no intervention. Another one is lockdown. And by this, I mean lockdown forever into the future. And the third one, which has been clicked here, is 40 days of lockdown. So there are several other interventions. So you can choose any one of these interventions. Our life-sized simulator, which works on the 1.24 crore city, has a lot more configurable interventions because we have to use it and respond to the questions that the people on the ground are posing to us. But here, these are the only interventions that you can see. Now, this is with no intervention. So you can see that the number of symptomatic individuals, those who show symptoms, actually rises at an exponential rate and eventually saturates in this 1 lakh city at 60,000. And you can also see how many are infectious at any point of time. The peak is after 50 days from March 1st. And the number of hospitalized, number that are hospitalized, the number of hospital beds that you need, the number of critical care beds you need, and the number of people that would have deceased. So all this information can be gotten. We also provide some additional information in the simulator, which is the source of infection. Because it's a simulator, we can, for each individual, where did that individual contract the infection from? And so that information we can gather and we can display it here. So we have tuned our simulator to the parameters have been chosen so that it's 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. But one can, based on past studies, one could actually modify the parameters to get this to the desired values. So this is for the no intervention case. Let me go to the scenario when there is a lockdown forever. So in this case, what happens is you have an initial increase, but then things cap down at 1/10 the previous level in terms of the number of symptomatic individuals, and all others are proportionately smaller. And in this case, because of the lockdown, you can see that most of the infection is actually from home, because people are mostly interacting in their homes. So it's the transmission is largely at home. And if you have this intervention, which is 40 days of lockdown, that's until May 3rd, followed by 30 days of home quarantine of infected individuals, schools and colleges are closed, and offices work at half the strength. Beyond those 30 days, that would be June 3rd onwards, you only have case isolation. That means an individual who is symptomatic recognizes that he has symptoms, and he or she isolates himself or herself in his or her home. And when that happens, you essentially may still see the infection spread, and this is how things spread. So here is the initial spread. Then there is the lockdown. The lockdown brings things down a little bit, and then there is an opening up, and then things start to go up again. That's after this opening up, which only involves case isolation after about 70 days or so since the start. Okay, so one can explore all of these things. This is largely to educate the public. Please play with it, and if you have any feedback on this, please get in touch with us. Now, I would like to discuss what are all the parameters that go into our model and what we do to tune our parameters. So there are quite a few parameters, as you would have suspected. For example, we have to instantiate 1.25 crore agents. So for that, we use the city census data, household distribution data from the census, household age mix, commute distances, school size distributions, office size distributions, unemployment rates, and so on. All of these we basically age distribution. I think household age mix, that should suffice. So all of these are used to generate the city. So those are all parameters, but hopefully those are parameters that you will agree are necessary parameters to create the synthetic city. And then there are these disease-based parameters, which we use based on paper, various studies that people have already published. So here there are parameters for severity, what is the asymptomatic fraction, and then age stratified hospitalization. So that's based on data that we get. Age stratified criticality. So those that are hospitalized, some of them move to criticality. We need data for that. We have used that data. Age stratified move to the disease state and so on. Additionally, there are some parameters that we need, which are contact rates, and what is the initial infection that we must seed and when. So these are the only things that we tune. All others are based on data that we have gotten from census, from various papers. This is something that we tune to the data, to the observed data. And we tune it so that, so we have in fact tuned it to the first, to match to the first 200 deaths in India. So we took all the deaths in India up to about April 9th. There were about 200 deaths until then. And we also made sure that we tuned only to the deaths, because if we tune to the cases, the protocol for the definition of a case is somewhat different, and it's difficult to match to the changing definition as well. So we prefer to match to the deaths, and we match to deaths up to April 9th. And since there is a long incubation period, symptomatic period, etc., the effect of the lockdown would not have been felt up to about April 14th or so. Those were our calculations. And so matching to the first 200 deaths in India would not, the lockdown would not have affected this. So in fact, we matched it to the no intervention scenario. And then we arrived at the contact rates and also when to seed. Once we have this information, we are then ready to run our city scale simulator. So we did this once for Mumbai and once for Bangalore, and we ran our simulations then subsequently with the lockdown parameters on it. Now I want to discuss 4 studies in the 15 minutes or so that's available. And the first study is a very quick study. It's basically the impact of phased emergence and the possibility of rise in infection once again. So for this, we had to have several definitions. So for example, we had to define what case isolation is. It's fairly clear, except that when you code it up into our simulator, we have to be very specific. So what this essentially means is that symptomatic cases stay at home for 7 days, which reduces non-household contacts. The non-household contacts reduced by 75%. So we have to specifically indicate this. And then household contacts remain unchanged during this period. And we assume about 70% of the households comply. Now, where do we get these numbers from? That's a different story. And I will share in one of the other studies some additional data that kind of suggests what these reductions are. Similarly, for home quarantine, voluntary home quarantine, once a symptomatic case has been identified, this person sees symptoms, then he voluntarily quarantines himself, and also all the members of the household. If this policy is in force, all the members of the household also remain quarantined for 14 days. In this case, what happens, because they are cloistered in their home, household contacts double. That increases the risk of inmates of the house being infected. But this is something that we can't avoid. But contacts with the community reduced by about 75%, like here. And we assume about 50% of the household comply because this is a somewhat severe restriction. This was for our original study. And then there are 3 different kinds of lockdown. This is the lockdown forever. This is lockdown for 26 days. So 26 days refers to the April 20th deadline. 21 days is April 14th, and then another additional 5 days to make it until the next Sunday. So that was lockdown 26. And this lockdown 40 is until May 3rd. So that's until 19th April until May 3rd. So there is a definition for this. And similarly, there is after the from the 20th on, there were some relaxations that were permitted. And so we call these as phased emergencies. PE stands for phased emergencies. And there were 3 kinds of phased emergencies. What these 3 things are specifically is not that important, except that some relaxations were there. And the OE stands for odd even. That means 50% of the individuals could go to work, and the other 50% would have to either work from home or would not be allowed to work. Okay, so there are these phased emergencies, and this is the kind of outcome that we got for Mumbai on the 19th. So this, we had it in our 19th report, and we assumed that when you have lockdown, we had 90% compliance. Home quarantine had about 50% compliance, but if you look at during the lockdown, about 90% of the individuals complied with this. So that was our assumption. And we had tuned our simulator to the no intervention case and to all India deaths. So in other words, for this, for tuning the parameters, we moved all of India's deaths to Mumbai, and then we tuned our simulator to that, and that too in the no intervention case. And then we have these 3 different lockdowns. Once we have the parameters, we actually let the infection evolve. We matched to the first few deaths. That's the seeding that we need to do at some prior time. And then we saw how the infection evolved through the lockdown. And our simulator was able to track this bend up to at least the 19th of April. And you'll actually see some other, in some later simulations, how we are able to track in the newer scenarios as well. So as you can see, this is in the log plot. This is a log plot. On the y-axis, we are showing fatalities. So this is the first death, 10 deaths, 100 deaths, 1,000, and 10,000. And in the no intervention scenario, we kind of our simulator predicted about 20,000. This is between 20 and 30,000 fatalities. New York City, as of today, has about 22,000 fatalities. So the scenario would have been like in New York City had we not intervened. With the interventions, these are the various predictions. The blue one is lockdown forever. The green one here is lockdown for 40 days. And then thereafter, we assumed at that stage only case isolation. And this yellow one is lockdown for 26 days. That is until April 14th. Until April 19th. And then from April 20th onwards, it was only case isolation. The other ones are intermediate here. And then one can see the kind of fatalities that this model predicts for each of these scenarios. Now, this is the because we can explicitly model the progression in the hospital as well. We could predict the number of beds, and from this you can sort of get a sense that if we remove all restrictions at this particular time, this was in our report of 19th April. If we assume that after May 3rd, all the restrictions are lifted except for perhaps case isolation, then things would go back to reasonably high levels. So this was something that we had identified at that time. Okay, so that was the first study. Now I want to highlight what our simulator can be used for. And these were sort of things that we wanted to study and take to people on the ground so that we could help them make their decisions. So for example, this was a study to highlight the importance of compliance. So if you looked at the Ministry of Home Affairs order of the 15th of April, you would see that there were many restrictions that continued to apply from the 15th until the 3rd of May. But a few activities were permitted. For example, IT and IT-enabled services could operate at 50% strength. Government of India offices, Government of Karnataka, and in general state and union territory offices could operate at 33%. And manufacturing and other industrial establishments which had access control could operate at full level, provided they followed some standard operating procedures. Now, the state authorities and the union territory authorities then were charged with deciding whether they had to enable these or not. Many chose not to enable them, but if they were to enable them, what would have been the consequences? And our tool is something that's well positioned to provide an answer to this question. But there was also this issue of compliance. I said that 70% compliance, 90% compliance, etc., are things that we need to program in our simulator. How do you decide this? So for this, we relied on data from Google, which was published for India on the 11th of April, which basically said that there had been, the lockdown had reduced movement significantly. There was a reduction of about 80% in retail and recreation, a reduction of about 55% in grocery and pharmacy shopping, a reduction of about 52% in parks and public places, and a reduction of about 64% in workplaces. So this reduction, the data that we got from Google, helped us inform the various choice. It gave us some information about what we should program in our simulator for the reduced rates of contact, so that we can run our simulator through the lockdown period. We still didn't know exactly what the compliance was because these are just indications about reductions in the contact rates. So we chose two particular compliance probabilities. 70% of the households complied in one scenario and 90% of the households complied in another scenario. And so what we wanted to compare is better compliance and opening up of the offices, is that better than or worse than lockdown for a longer period of time? So that was the question that we asked ourselves and we tried to provide an answer for. So there is a detailed scenario description. I'll go over this scenario description very briefly. No intervention from 1st of March to 13th of March. Sort of pre-lockdown in Bangalore, in Karnataka, was there between 14th and the 24th. And then from the 25th onwards, there was the national lockdown. So all of that we merged as a lockdown. And then here are the phased openings. Now, as you can see here, the Government of India and Government of Karnataka offices could operate at either 0% or 33%. And then during this period, we assumed that they opened up to 100% levels. IT and IT enabled services, 0% or 50%, and 50% and 100% here. So the local authorities had to decide whether to allow at 33% or not allow, whether to allow IT and IT enabled services at 50% or not allow, and so on. So we actually studied all of these scenarios. There are a total of 8 possibilities, but in the plots that I'm going to show, complete closure, which is the 0%, 0%, 0%, followed by these openings, versus openings at these levels. So those two extremes alone I will show, and then I'll describe it along with compliance as well. So there are other definitions which I will skip. Now here is a somewhat busy slide which says what the outcomes are. So on this slide here, you actually see in linear scale the number of hospitalized cases for Bangalore, and this is up to about May 14th or so. Sorry, May 15th, May 16th. This is up to day before yesterday, May 17th. Sorry, this is 15th, 16th, 17th. Yes. The blue curve is lockdown. The other two curves here are actually opening up completely versus keeping all the offices shut until May 3rd and then opening up in that phased fashion. But we assume 90% compliance. So all of these three curves correspond to 90% compliance. Here is a lockdown curve, but lockdown with only 70% compliance. So that means 70% of the households comply with the lockdown rules, 30% defy the lockdown rules. In that scenario, we have this particular magenta curve that you see here. And it appears that in Mumbai, in Bangalore, we appear to be closer to the 70% compliance factor. And if you open up all the workplaces versus have the workplaces closed and then opened up in a phased fashion, then these are the kinds of workplace control outcomes that you have. And you can see clearly one takeaway here is that if you have lockdown at 70%, that's clearly worse than lockdown. That's clearly worse than opening up the workplaces, but at 90% control, 90% compliance. And so what one would like to invest more time and energy in is to ensure compliance. Then you can actually have your workplaces open up rather than having lockdown for an extended period of time. And here, this is with lockdown 70% compliance, and we haven't even taken into account lockdown fatigue. With lockdown fatigue, things would rise at a faster pace. And so this study suggests that it might be better to invest more time and energy in compliance and open up workplaces. That might be better than extending lockdown. Okay, so that's one outcome. On this side, you essentially have the same plot, but in logarithmic scale. This is in linear scale. This is the number of hospitalized cases. So if you want, then one could look at this particular figure. But the main message has already been conveyed, that compliance and phased opening up is better than lockdown extended, but at a lower level of compliance. And this quantifies the extent to which it's better. And this is something that our simulator is capable of providing. Okay, I'll now move to another study. I have about 5 minutes, so I'll just quickly work through these two more studies, and then we can open up for questions. So in this study, we looked at opening up of Mumbai trains and also phased emergence of workplaces. And these are largely slides from studies conducted by our TIFR Mumbai colleagues. So here are the modeling details. So we assume that there is case isolation and home quarantine after we open up. So this is a common sense control, and I think people are aware also of this particular disease's impact now. And so we can anticipate that people will case isolate and home quarantine. What does that mean? After 24 hours of a person showing symptoms, the entire household is quarantined. And that means this family can no longer go to work, and visits to community centers are significantly lowered. It's 10% of the normal. So you probably go to do grocery shopping maybe once every 3 days or something like that. And only one person goes. So if only one person goes every day, If the average household is 10, that's about 25% activity to the in the community center. But if you reduce it by a factor of 3, that is, you go once in 3 days, then it brings it down to a little less than 10%. We also assume that masks are prevalent, and this happened to be the case in Mumbai after April 9th or so. And there is a certain percentage based on some past studies. It's not conclusive, but there is some information that suggests that masks may reduce transmission by about 20% if individuals wear masks. It's of course asymmetric. So for example, those who are infected, if they wear masks, the transmission is lowered significantly. But this is for the case when healthy individuals are wearing masks. And then we also assume the following model for containment zones. Containment zones were modeled as partially closed. That is, a ward was partially closed, and it's closed in proportion to the number of hospitalized cases. And there is a specific definition here. If there are no hospitalized cases, the ward is completely open. So it's open for normal activity. On the other hand, if 1 in 1,000 in the population are hospitalized, in Mumbai's case, that would have been about 500,000, assuming 500,000 average per ward, that's about 500. So if 500 individuals are hospitalized, then the ward is 90% closed. And between these two extremes, there is a sort of linear interpolation. And we also assume that those 60 and above stayed at home. And these are the various definitions for opening up between May 18th and May 31st, June 1st and June 30th, and July onwards. 33% opening up, 50% opening up, 100% opening up, versus the third case is 100, 100, 100. That means we start operation, full operation from May 18th onwards, assuming, of course, the common sense case isolation, home quarantine, etc. Okay, so when this is the case, there are two things to look for here. One is the solid red curve, and the other one is the dashed red curve. One of them refers to trains being off, that is, trains are not in operation, and this one corresponds to trains being on. And what we see here is basically the impact of trains. So infections rise quite a bit. This needs to be corroborated. It's a preliminary study, but this suggests to what extent it might have an impact on the infection. And this downswing, the upswing is because of the opening up of the trains. This upswing is because of general opening up. This extra upswing is because of the opening up of trains. And then this downswing that you see is because of wards closing down as a consequence of a large number of hospitalized cases. So one can get such numbers as well. And this is how the doubling time has increased thanks to the lockdown. But then once you bring things down, the doubling time becomes smaller. And then lockdown comes back. So in those zones, and you have increased doubling time and then decreased doubling time and so on. So if one wants to see in terms of doubling times, one can see this. Now I have one more study. So that was for Mumbai. I have one more study which is related to neighborhood containment. What type of containment is better? Is 100-meter zone containment better, or ward containment better? I have about a couple of minutes, so maybe I'll just discuss that quickly, and then I'll open the floor up for questions. So the metrics that are involved here when we want to say whether one is better or the other is better is the health outcome, number of cases, looking a little into the future, which could be the number of cases that require hospital care. There is also another metric, which is the number of healthy individuals who are quarantined as a consequence of this containment zone. For every, so the metric could be the number of healthy individuals who are quarantined in the zone for every hospitalized individual in that zone. Lower this value, the better. And this is sort of a reweighted version of what could be a proxy for economic cost. Okay, so there are various definitions of what neighborhood containment is. So a neighborhood is basically a circular region, in Karnataka's definition, a circular region of 100 meters around a case. And that we have approximated as a rectangular or as a square region. In fact, even our maps do indicate only a square region of the same area as a circular region with radius 100 meters. So that all those individuals in that containment zone around the case are contained. That means that they can't go to work. Their community interactions come down significantly. Case isolation, home quarantining, social distancing of the elderly is strictly enforced. And because it is enforceable, we assume that there is 100% compliance in this. This is sort of a best case scenario. On the other hand, there is another possibility, which is the moment a case appears, a hospitalized case appears, you have containment in the entire ward. And this would be one of Bangalore's 198 administrative wards treated as a zone that would be contained. In this case, because enforcement is difficult it's difficult to enforce this, we assume, and you're also inconveniencing a lot more people, we assume that workplace contacts are about 25%. That's for essential services. Community contacts are about 25%. One person in the household goes out to buy groceries, etc. per day. Social distancing, case isolation, home quarantining are strictly enforced. And there is 70% compliance of this particular lockdown in that local zone. Now notice that neighborhood containment is stricter because it's enforceable, easily enforceable compared to ward containment. And you're also giving it the advantage of 100% compliance. Now I'll just summarize the study in this plot here. You'll have to go to this particular plot and look at the log plot to be able to see what is happening here. So this is the scenario with lockdown. And as you can see, we are actually tracking our simulator appears to track the infections, the number of hospitalized cases in Bangalore reasonably well. This is as of May 17th. So this is the lockdown forever, assuming a certain compliance. I think it's 70% compliance in the rest of the population. And then this brown curve is for ward containment, and the violet curve is for neighborhood containment. And as you can see, sometime into the future, it appears that if you do ward containment, it's actually better than neighborhood containment. This is if you only have home quarantine. This red curve is if you have only home quarantine, social distancing of the elderly, and schools and colleges being closed. So what this suggests is that ward containment is better in terms of health outcomes than neighborhood containment. And we think this may be because of the number of asymptomatics and pre-symptomatics that transmit in our model. And there is also a significant amount of symptomatic transmission before a particular individual comes to the hospital. We assume that this person is identified only after we recognize that he needs hospital care. And so there is some amount of time lag before an individual goes to the hospital for hospital care. And because of this uncertainty, asymptomatic transmission, pre-symptomatic transmission, significant amount of symptomatic transmission, it's better to have wider containment, ward containment, rather than just zone containment. Of course, in the initial phases, you don't see much of a difference. It's all within a certain uncertainty zone. But if you let things evolve, we see the difference around the end of, say it's significant around the end of July. So it's the difference between about 500 fatalities and about 1,000 fatalities by the end of July. And so ward containment may be better than zone containment. So this is another outcome of another use of our simulator. So it can help in decisions like this. Now, in terms of the economic cost, or in terms of the cost inconveniencing, there's quite a bit of inconveniencing. For example, in the case of ward containment, that's the brown curve, between let's say about 300 and about 1,500 people who are healthy are actually held back for every hospitalized individual. So that's a significant multiplication factor compared to between 100 and about 300 for zone containment. So there's quite a bit of inconveniencing that happens here. And this is a trade-off that the health officials and the city planners could use. This data they could use to essentially decide whether they have to go with zone containment or ward containment. Now, this Robust. There is actually quite a bit of robustness to model uncertainty. I have some slides to indicate that here to provide evidence of that. But I'll just go directly to this takeaway slide, which says that ward containment is better, has a better health outcome than neighborhood containment. The number of cases is 10,000 in case of ward containment versus 16,000. And I mentioned the number of fatalities as well. This is sort of surprising at first glance, but because there's quite a bit of uncertainty arising from asymptomatic, pre-symptomatic, and symptomatic transmission, before there's quite a bit of spread that could happen before the individual comes to the hospital. And that's when you know that you have to contain this particular zone. So it's in that circumstance, it's better to contain it at the ward level than at the 100-meter radius level. The efficiencies, there are some numbers here. And this conclusion is robust. We looked at asymptomatic fraction 60% as well as 33%. I think I've run out of time. So I will skip this discussion about this calculator that we have built, which is to enable companies to assess their readiness. I'll now end my part of the talk and then maybe open the floor up for questions.
Yeah, thank you, Rajesh. It was a wonderful talk. We'll wait for other people to start asking questions in between. I have a couple. So I'll
Yes.
get the discussion started. One is in your code, does the time of interaction between individuals matter? Or is it that they just have some overlap in space-time which is relevant?
So in our code, the way it actually works is we have a granularity of about 6 hours.
Uh-huh.
So that means every 6 hours, we are updating interactions and then infections. So what we do is we look at individuals in a household that have been infected in the last, let's say that has been updated. And then for the 6-hour interaction, we basically assess whether a particular individual will be infected or not. So it's at that level of granularity. And I'm not sure whether that answers your question or if you have something more specific that you
no,
would like.
it does in some sense, because if the interaction is very short spaced in time, then perhaps it will not really matter. I mean, is there a probabilistic element to it that if two people are in contact, is there a probability of infection, or is the infection a certainty in that case?
Yeah, so the way we actually model this is we actually don't have movements of individuals.
Right.
So one could come up with such a more detailed activity model. In fact, in transportation scenarios where you're trying to essentially assess traffic patterns and things like that, one needs to take that into account. In this case, because our goal was largely to identify the number of infections, how the epidemic will pan out, it suffices to know who all you will interact with and what would be the chance of an infection when you interact with them during the course of a day. But we wanted a finer granularity than a day because there were some indications that this is the duration for which an individual could potentially be. These were based on estimates. There was no direct evidence, but there was indirect evidence that pre-symptomatic transmission could be from half a day to up to 2 days or so. So the granularity was at least half. So we had to keep it smaller than half a day. And so we chose 6 hours.
The other is about when you calculate the compliance fraction, do you kind of leave out people who are in professions which have to, I mean, where people have to work, health services, sanitation services, law and order, supply of essentials, and so on. So is that kind of counted in the 30% who are not complying, or is that separate within this model?
So when it is separate, so what we actually take into account is essential services must take place.
Right.
That means there is some amount of background minimal activity that always happens. And so that's the Compliance is over and above that. So, for example, you might have a household that is compliant is also in our model a household parameter. So we generally take it that if there is this may not necessarily be the case, but for our modeling purposes, we assume that if household is compliant, all the individuals in that household follow the rules. If a household is defiant, then all the individuals in that household they pursue normal activity. And so this compliance is over and above this regular activity. So all in there will be 25% activity for essential services and so on. Then on top of that, we have additional activity coming from non-compliance.
So there's a question from Smriti Mahajan. How easy is it to adapt this code for other cities?
Okay, what would you need to build a similar simulator for other cities? So we would like exactly these kinds of information. We need the census data. We need the age profile. We need then additional information about household sizes, workplace sizes, commute distances, and school sizes. So in some cases, we can make do without some of these finer aspects. But definitely, I think we want to take into account age distribution, household sizes, and workplace sizes for that particular area. So we were able to grab this information from the web for Bangalore. We were also able to do this for Mumbai because it was needed for our studies. Additionally, with some effort, we got it for New York City and Wuhan as well. And we have some preliminary studies on that. We are not ready to share it yet because we are still fine-tuning some of our predictions because the disease has progressed quite some distance in these two places. And we would like to have our simulator match them better. But we have been able to instantiate those cities as well. So how much effort would it be? So I think you must have a team of about 2 to 3 people that are willing to scrape the internet, get this data. And then this group must be familiar with some Python programming because the data that you get may be in a format which is not readily usable. So you have to essentially massage it to turn it into a format that our simulator, that our cities generator can take. So that I think our group may be able to help you to some extent. The formats, etc., are all made public, but we can also try to help if you're interested in doing that. And then once this is ready, it's just a matter of 2 hours to run the script. So Bangalore takes about 1.25 crore. Bangalore takes about I might be wrong in this. I think it's probably shorter than this, but let's safely estimate it to be about 2 hours. In 2 hours, we are able to generate a synthetic city. Okay. And all our simulations are on two synthetic cities with the same parameters. Okay. And we run for each scenario multiple times. But coming back to your specific question, yes, it will be a little bit of effort. You'll need about 2 to 3 people who are willing to work to get data from the internet and then willing to script and turn the data from unfriendly formats to friendly formats so that our simulator can be, our city generator can run on them.
Okay. Other questions?
Rajesh, this is Vaibhav here. I have one question. So in your initial plots for the number of fatalities, it seems the plots were shifted in time, but in both the cases, the number of fatalities were the same. So do you have any insights on why is that the case?
Can you tell me which plot, this one you mean?
No, I think before this.
This is the first plot with cases and fatalities. Maybe you're speaking about this?
Yeah.
Okay. So there is actually quite a bit of stochasticity in the way things evolve. So we seed our city with about 100 infections. Now these 100 infections, so the chance of a death from among these 100 individuals is about 0.22%. So it's actually quite small. So, and that happens about 26 days later. That's when you're likely to see from among these 100 individuals the first death. When things are have that low probability, you have to essentially wait until the infection spreads to some extent before you start seeing the first death. And so that time from the seeding of the infection to the appearance of the first death is actually a random quantity, a random time. So we run about, due to time limitations, we have 2 synthetic cities and we have about 5 runs on each synthetic city. So we have a total of about 10 runs. What you see here is the standard error. So these, if you see this window of uncertainty, that window of uncertainty is the standard error around this lockdown 70% curve. So since we match only to the first few deaths, and that too when there are few in number, there is quite a bit of uncertainty, and you will actually see things wiggle around quite a bit. And amongst the 10 tries, we had significant variation. We have plotted the mean and 1 standard deviation around it. So I would say that we have actually trapped it reasonably well.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Jasjeet, are there any
So
other
I don't
questions?
see anyone else waving their hands. So does someone have a question? I think Professor Arun Grover wants to ask a question.
Okay, sure.
No? Okay.
Okay, so
I hope there is no.
yeah, probably he has some microphone issue.
Hello, Jasjeet.
Yes.
So, given these simulations, so do you think that in Bombay they will ever take the decision to let the trains run?
I'm afraid that is not a question that we will be able to answer, because I think there are many factors that come into the picture in order to make a decision of this sort, whether to let trains run or not. What our simulations can tell is this is what would happen if you try an opening up versus not opening up. Also, it's only a comparative tool. We don't want our users of this particular tool to rely on the numbers. I think we would like them to look at it as A versus B comparison tool. Is this better than that? So should I open it up with larger distance between individuals? Should I open it up at 30%? And things of that sort. So I think we can use the simulator to come up with such comparisons, and then we'll have to leave it to the city officials to decide whether they want to open up or not.
See, in
That's
Bombay, the
my-
trains carry a lot of load. Now, the Delhi metro does not carry that kind of a load. Okay. And so I don't know whether a simulator for Delhi would give a better feel of which lines to run, which lines not to run. Because in Bombay, if you have to run, you have to run all the 3 lines, or you don't run any line at all.
That's right. Yes. So in Delhi, there is an added complication that the lines are spread out quite a bit. So the way we actually model transportation is we think of it as one additional community space. And we know we have information on how many people are using the trains. That information has been used. And then each individual comes in contact with others in the train during a certain period in the morning and during a certain period in the evening.
Yes.
So we have modeled that as well. So we have taken these things into account and come up with how the infection will spread. Now, as you will see from my explanation, it's actually just one contact space, one additional contact space. What you're probably thinking of is if I have only certain lines run. Now we can go back to our code and we can modify it to have people associated with lines. That is also something that we can do. And then we can try to see if this line alone is open, then all the individuals associated with that line with some probability will use this particular line. So I can think of a way by which we can modify our simulator to answer your specific question. What would be the impact of opening up certain lines and so on? And once again, I would like to add that it would be, if I open this line, is it better versus if I open that line, is it better? I think we can answer that kind of a question. But if you want to come up with estimates of what might be the infection level, then one shouldn't rely on the numbers that we provide. But we can answer your question partially by modifying our tool.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Are there any on the YouTube chat?
There are. So Smriti Mahajan's question came from there.
Came from there. Okay.
Yeah. So that was the only question from there. I think there aren't any more questions. If there are, we'll get back to you on email.
Okay.
Thanks a lot, Rajesh, for the wonderful talk. And I hope you have inspired some of our colleagues to join hands and have a Chandigarh area or a Tri-City model set up for local use over here. Thank you. Thank you very much, Rajesh.
Yeah, thank you very much. If somebody wants to build a Chandigarh simulator, we'll be most happy to help them. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.